Thank you, everyone. It is truly an incredible delight to be here. Most people open up with that type of statement, but usually I'm giving these lectures in a hotel conference room in some godforsaken city, and so to come to your beautiful country truly is a delight and an honor. We've both just been thrilled to be able to spend time with people here who are really advancing the field of mHealth, who are interested in using informatics and in using platforms to really transform healthcare. And what Beth and I are going to show you is some work that's been kind of a life mission for both of us over the last several years, and that's around the space of choir. Now you'll note that, by the way, the title is actually different from what's in your program. Beth will actually be talking about, in just a few minutes, this issue of precision surgical care and using a targeted intervention for that. I'm going to be talking more broadly about an open source, open platform model for measuring health outcomes and as a platform for a learning healthcare system. Now, by way of background, I'm the division chief for pain medicine at Stanford, and I'm a clinician, and I spend about 1 day a week taking care of patients, and the other 6 days a week I spend in the lab. Somewhat similar to what Beth does. And I realized in the spirit of this meeting, I should have put my where are you, Mackey? Twitter ID there. Great. All right, we're off and running. So, let me start off. I added in some slides during the last speaker because I forgot to take my OCD pills. And I wanted to make sure I was meeting the needs of this audience. And so I added in a little bit more information about pain to give some background. It's traditional in our country these days with issues of conflict of interest to understand where your speaker's coming from and whose pocket he or she is, getting their money from, if you will. And I'll share with you that all of our money comes from our National Institutes of Health. So it means it comes from the taxpayers. None of the money that we're using is coming from industry. So we have no industry conflicts to report. And diving in on the issue of pain, these are slides that I just added in. Pain's a big deal in our country and in your country and across the world. I was honored to be part of an Institute of Medicine report. The Institute of Medicine is our country's main advisory board. It's a nonpartisan, non-government advisory board that advises on all things under medical care and also sciences. It's part of the National Academy of Sciences. And it's just recently changed its name to the National Academy of Medicine. And I was part of this panel that put together a report on the state of pain in our country, and we found that there's about 100 million Americans who have pain. That's about 37% of the US adult population. I'll share with you that's about the same percentage, about 37 to 40% of what's in Europe. Indirect and direct medical expenditures about $500 billion a year, works out to 1.8 billion US per million people per year. If you do the math, and you do the conversion rates on the currencies, it's almost exactly the same amount as what we see here in Europe. So we've all got this huge problem. And by the way, that burden, that problem, is bigger than diabetes, heart disease, and cancer combined. Those are huge numbers. One of the other messages that would be put forward is that while pain can be a symptom of a condition, when it becomes chronic and persistent, it can become a disease in and of its own right. You heard the last speaker talk about diabetes. Well, diabetes often starts with high blood sugar, leads into something called impaired glucose tolerance, so that if you eat a bagel or a croissant, you don't appropriately respond to it from an insulin standpoint, and then leads on to this frank disease of diabetes that affects multiple organ systems. Pain does exactly the same thing. And so I want to start off with a personal example here to help ground everything. And this is Sandra. Sandra's a patient who's given me permission to talk about her. She is currently about 31 or 32, but back in her early 20s, she was a college student. She was a college student in the Northeast United States. She was driving along the road. She was listening to Britney Spears on the radio. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, she was T-boned by another car. And she injured her ankle. And she was taken to the emergency department. Her ankle ultimately healed up, but the pain never went away. And the pain spread. And she ended up with this terrible condition we call complex regional pain syndrome. And CRPS is something you never want to have. It's like having a blowtorch on your foot and leg 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it has a propensity to spread. And in her case, it spread to her upper extremity. She works at at Walt Disney World, and after 10 years of treatment out there, decided to come out and see me at Stanford, and I've been treating her for the last several years. And so this question that we all are trying to answer in healthcare, and particularly in our field in pain, is how do we know if we're actually getting somebody like Sandra better? And what does better mean? I've been challenged on this over 10 or 15 years ago, and I used to say, well, I get these nice fruitcakes and bottles of wine over the holiday, and as a show of their expression of gratitude. And they'd say, yeah, but how, Mackey, how do you really know they're getting better? And I realized I didn't know. I didn't know if they were actually getting better. And how do I know what treatment is better for a certain patient under a specific condition? One of the little secrets that we have in our field is that on any given day, we're right about 40-50% of the time. And so we go through this very laborious trial and error process. Complicating this is the fact that pain is really complicated. It's a very challenging condition. This is a network flow diagram of just some of the mechanical and biopsychosocial factors that play a role. There'll be a quiz on this at the end of the 30 minutes, guys. We ask our fellows to memorize this, and it's just impossible to keep all of this in our head. Here's the other little secret about our field and about medicine in general. And that is, when we do randomized controlled clinical trials on medications and treatments, we enroll only about 10% or less of the patients that we screen. And those 10% of the patients that we enroll, they look nothing like who we care for in the real world situation. Nothing at all. And so the problem is that we develop these treatments, these medications, these devices, for people for whom they were never intended for. They were intended for this very homogeneous group of people. They were not intended for people like Sandra, who've got lots of other issues going on. And that slide just kind of illustrates that point, is that we put these medications out into the wild for a population upon which they were not intended. The Institute of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health in the U.S. have recognized this issue, and they've called for, in the area of pain, more consistent data on pain. We called for that in the IOM pain report. I recently co-chaired the follow-up to this, the National Pain Strategy, which outlines a strategic plan for our country and how to reshape how we care and assess for pain in our country. And we called for more data needed on the prevalence, onset, course, impact, and outcomes for common chronic pain conditions. This was also followed up by the IOM report on the learning healthcare systems, which extend things beyond the registry platforms that we're all used to talking about into learning healthcare systems, which combine science, informatics, incentives, and culture, and aligning those for continuous quality improvement and innovation. And these are some of the characteristics of a continuous learning healthcare system, one in which you have a real-time data repository that's continually being updated, you've got real-time in the background informatics being run on it, that you have patient and clinician engagement so that you're empowering your patients to actually do what they need to do, all the while having them think it was their idea to do it. That's a big part of what we're doing. We need to do that to align incentives so that we're actually paying more for quality care that's delivering real outcomes, and to ultimately change the culture of how we care for patients. The National Institutes of Health have been calling for something like this for some time and having what we call high throughput technologies. And that means this very rapid translation between these large data sets into the real world. But the problem is that there's huge subject burden as a consequence of these platforms and these ideas, that they also have a huge amount of provider burden. The physicians, the psychologists, the physical therapists, and others can't keep track of all this information in their mind. And also the electronic data capture systems don't talk with their EMRs. And so up until recently, we've had this huge problem with not having appropriate platforms. And that's what motivated us to develop CHOIR, Collaborative Health Outcomes Information Registry, which is an open source, open standard, incredibly flexible and free, my favorite four-letter F word, free health treatment registry and a platform for our learning healthcare system. We use this for point-of-care decision-making, for comparative effectiveness research, longitudinal outcomes research to be able to track patients over time in real-world situations. Something called pragmatic trials, which we're building in, and this allows us to do randomized controlled trials in our clinic environments, software-based decision-making, and it also allows us to get a very deep phenotype of our patients. We built this so that from the ground up it was easy to use for patients, clinicians, and staff alike, and we integrated them very early. We have automated email reminders that are sent out to patients to fill this out at home, and they fill it out at home. It used to be on their PCs and Macs, but it's growing more and more and more where they're filling it all out on smartphones, to where that's now taking over as a high percentage. We do automatic data import in from our electronic medical record, and we provide here reports for the physicians and psychologists and physical therapists to care for the patients. A little bit of a current status update on this. We've been out and running for almost 4 years now. Pardon me. We also rolled out a special version of this for pediatric pain, which has been running since 2014. We integrated it in smoothly. It's a web-based model using a client-server approach. It runs on every mobile device using responsive technologies. We got the staff involved early, and this is one of the critical things, is to get the staff and the clinicians involved early. We have about 15,000 unique patients and about 50,000 longitudinal data assessments, and we built our own local computer adaptive testing engine that I'm going to talk about here in just a moment. More importantly, and I think one of the things that caught us all by surprise early on, was how it fundamentally changed the culture of how we care for patients at Stanford, to where it's now more of an outcomes-based model. Our system is the one that you see ahead of you, in front of you. We're a comprehensive, coordinated, interdisciplinary care center. We see about 20,000 patient visits a year. We're the largest center west of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's got a big center. We have about 26 faculty across all walks of life, all different specialties, all coming together in a co-located specialty, and we have a tight integration in with our research group. I mentioned that we built our own local computer adaptive testing engine. The motivation for this is because we leverage the NIH PROMIS system. If you're doing patient-reported outcomes, you really want to know PROMIS. PROMIS stands for the Patient-Reported Outcomes Measurement Information Systems. It's a $120 million investment by the National Institutes of Health to recast all patient-reported outcomes in our country using modern IRT, item response theory, as well as lending itself to computer adaptive testing. And what that means is that very efficiently you can capture domains of physical, psychological, social functioning, and global health. The other beauty is that it gives you a normative statistic. It gives you a t-stat that is normed across a population with a t-stat of 50, a mean of 50, and a standard deviation of 10, which means that you can compare a patient here in Palo Alto, California, where we live, with somebody in Gainesville, with somebody up here in New York, and it's being translated into other countries and normed across statistics so that we'll ultimately have a global norm. The initial survey, we have take our intake survey. They take about 22 minutes or so to fill out a very complex set of information, which used to take them closer to 30 to 45 minutes until we brought it into Choir. The follow-up surveys, where we're capturing over 14 domains of physical, psychological, social functioning, and an interactive body map, take about 9 minutes. As a consequence, nobody complains. Nobody complains. To give you the real numbers, if you were going to use legacy instruments, the typical instruments that we're used to capturing for these PROs, you would answer across 8 different domains of physical and psychological functioning about 144 questions. If you use CAT, computer adaptive testing, it's down to 39, with a similar standard error of the mean, which leads to almost a 75% reduction in burden to the patient. That's a real savings, and as a consequence, again, nobody complains. In going across the country and across the world, what I found is that the number one reason why these systems fail is because of lack of buy-in. They don't get the clinicians and the people actually using them engaged early and frequently in helping with the design of it. And as a consequence, they die a slow death. And so we worked very hard to get our staff, our physicians, our patients engaged early into this. Dr. Ming Cao, one of our director of operations and also a PhD biostatistician, has developed something called Choir Provider, which takes the Choir output and generates about 80 to 90% of a clinical note for the clinician. He's become very popular in the clinics. So we're spending less time typing out notes and more time spending with patients. I want to give you just a couple snapshots. We've published now a number of papers that have used Choir as a base, and I just want to show you how we've used this in our clinical practice and as well as in the research front. So let's go back to Sandra, shall we? So Sandra first came out to see me from Walt Disney World, and when she came to see me, she filled out Choir, and the scores are here in front of you. And you'll note that the higher scores are worse functioning, by the way. And so Sandra had a fair amount of emotional distress. She was depressed, she was anxious, highly fatigued. And she had a lot of physical dysfunction, pain interference, and pain behaviors. She'd been trying out a multitude of medications and other treatments. I put her on a tricyclic antidepressant that works for pain that surprisingly she hadn't been on, as well as another drug that we've been studying that's a glial cell inhibitor that's kind of an old new drug, if you will. And what we found is when she came back that she had a dramatic reduction in her fatigue, in her depression, her anxiety, and also pain interference. What do you note, by the way, on the screen that's not changing here? Any takers? What's not budging? Physical function, absolutely. Physical function's not changing. This one has been an eye-opener for us that's shown up time and time again. And that is you can change people's pain. You can change your pain interference, you can change your emotional functioning. But unless you specifically target physical function, it often does not move. And so what we did here, I don't know if this slide is here. Yeah, I did. We brought in a health educator who was working with us at the time to focus on goal-oriented behaviors and goal setting. She wanted to hike, she wanted to do more walking, and so we set goals on increasing that in a slow, incremental way, and what we find is she had a significant improvement in her physical function when she came back. That's an example of using this in a targeted, single patient example. Let's move on now to how we're ultimately trying to achieve our vision for turning our clinics into research labs. That's what the future is. We need to turn all of our clinics into a research lab, one in which all patients are being studied and characterized. That doesn't mean turning them into lab rats, by the way. It just means truly understanding what we're doing to them and then using that information to improve care. One of the biggest problems that we have in all healthcare is that of poor diagnostic standards and poor integration of those diagnostic standards into our clinical workflow. I'll share with you, our physicians use whatever available code they can from a diagnostic standpoint. We've built in research quality, research grade clinical diagnostic codes into our system that allows us to really trust what code that we're giving. We've developed huge amounts of patient data now. If you look at low back pain, if you're going to do a clinical trial in the US, you have to pre-register on clinicaltrials.gov. If you go there now, you'll see over 500 interventional trials on low back pain, with a mean of about 650. At last count, we have over 5,000 patients who have low back pain on our registry, over time, almost 10 times more. And this size of data allows you to go beyond the simple linear, parametric type of analyses that you would do with most of these studies into very sophisticated analytical techniques that will draw out nuances, and I'm going to show you that in just a few minutes. Drew Sturgeon is one of our rock star postdocs in the lab. He came out of Alex Zoutra's lab, focusing on resilience and social functioning. He's also had an interest in fatigue, and so he did a structural equation model on some of the acquired data, published this, I think this was last year. And what was interesting about this is that usually we all know that when you have an increase in pain, your physical function goes down, you have more pain interference. That's pretty obvious, and that's been shown. But it turns out that when you build that model, that it is all subserved through this link through fatigue. And what that means is that our patients get increase in pain and they get fatigued, which leads to a decrease in their physical function and an increase in their pain interference. Fatigue is only starting to be really appreciated. I will share with you, we do not have good treatments for fatigue in healthcare, and it's something we need to clearly pay much more attention to. Drew, as I mentioned, has a strong interest in social functioning, and so he did a different model here using similar structural equation modeling. This paper just came out recently. And similarly, we also know that as your pain goes up and your physical function goes down, you often get depressed, you get angry. But we find, or I should say he found, is that this was subserved entirely by your satisfaction with social roles. And so what we've learned from this is that what's really going on is that your pain goes up, your physical function goes down. And it's that it is your impairment with your ability to interact with everybody, your inability to now engage socially, that causes you to become depressed and angry. And that's intriguing because we've always talked about pain as a biopsychosocial disease, but it's always with a small s at the end. And we're learning more and more that this social functioning aspect is a critical part of it. Now, for those of you who do a lot of structural equation modeling, there's a lot of limitations to doing cross-sectional mediation analysis, which we can talk about. And so we're always careful about drawing causal inferences with this type of cross-sectional data, but it does give us insights into where this is going. I'm going to show you a paper that Dr. Darnell led the effort on and is in review right now. And this is around the area of catastrophizing. Dr. Darnell is the queen of catastrophizing. She she has built her career in part. She's got a lot of layers, but one of those layers is around catastrophizing, also interested in sex differences in pain and opioids and that intersection between it. And she asked this simple question: are there differences between men and women related to the prescribing or the likelihood of being on an opioid? And so we took about 1,800 patients, and her leading this effort developed heat maps here that show the differences between men and women. And let me just describe to you what this heat map shows. But before doing that, I realized we have a mixed audience here, and so you may not all know what catastrophizing is. And so let me just quickly define it. It's an abnormal cognitive and emotional state of mind. It is composed of three major components, composed of negative amplification of something. In this case, we're talking about pain. 2, it's rumination. It's repetitive thoughts over and over again. You can't get the pain out of your mind. And 3, it's a sense of loss of control. You have no control over your pain. So let's go back to the question: are men and women different when it comes to prescribing opioids? And the answer here is yes. And what we find is that if you're a man, you're much more likely to be on opioids due to higher pain intensity. But if you're a woman, you're more likely to be on opioids due to high pain catastrophizing. Now, that's interesting, but what I think is actually interesting, what we think is actually really interesting, is that when you pull that data, when Dr. Darnell pulls this data, and you look at men and women and likelihood to be on opioids, where we typically think of catastrophizing is in this high range here of around 30-31, which we define as clinically significant. This is what we pay attention to. But what we note here, using sophisticated general additive modeling, nonlinear modeling of the data, which is only possible because of the large data sets, we find that this subclinical range here is incredibly important. And this is an area that we typically ignore, this subclinical range of emotional distress. But we're finding that we need to start paying much more attention to this area and not just focusing on the people at the very severe end of the range. And so this in part motivated Dr. Darnell to develop a brief psychobehavioral intervention that targets specifically catastrophizing. Instead of the 8 to 9 week class of bringing people in every week and sitting in that chair, she developed a course that's about 2 hours in length. We integrated this into our clinic environment. We did it in a pragmatic, a real-world trial, and found dramatic reductions in pain catastrophizing with her interventions, as well as pain interference, behavior, and fatigue, and as a consequence got a NIH grant that she'll talk with you about maybe a little bit more in just a moment. Before turning it over to her, I want to just briefly mention one of the multiple areas that we're going into with Choir, and that's in the surgical environment. What we find is that there's about 50 million surgeries that are done in the US each year. What is not appreciated is about on average 10% of people who undergo a major surgery will end up with some degree of persistent pain. We don't often talk about that. Surgery is a major cause of a lot of the persistent pain that we have in our society. What we've spent the last 7 years doing in our group is characterizing factors that cause people to have persistent pain after surgery. And what we find is that what you bring to the operating room table, to that operating room theater, often has more to do with whether you're going to get chronic pain than the surgery itself. And there are things such as preoperative depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and yes, catastrophizing is probably one of the biggest predictors of whether you're going to get that. And so we put Choir into the pre-op environment, in the pre-op clinic, where we now characterize all patients that are coming in to have surgery at Stanford with the idea of developing the predictors and then targeting interventions. And I think it's at that point that I turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Beth Darnell, who's going to talk with you about this novel intervention in the perioperative environment.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I just want to say your country is so beautiful. It's my first time here, and I'm really excited to be here and just be able to experience just a little bit of all that it has to offer. Thank you so much, Sean. I'm going to talk about precision healthcare, and that's really about phenotyping patients and then based on that information developing and delivering targeted therapies tailored to the individual. And what Choir is doing is it's allowing us to deliver precision perioperative pain medicine. And so that's the focus of what I'm going to talk about. In the Stanford hospital, we see 20,000 patients each year before surgery. So they come into the pre-op clinic and we assess them medically to ensure that they're appropriate for whatever surgery that they're scheduled for. And this is pretty typical in the United States. I'm not sure how it's done in Ireland, but we medically assess people and then really focus on the medical components. What's lacking here is any sort of assessment of psychosocial domains. So this is really an unmet need because, as Sean was just mentioning, some of these psychosocial factors turn out to be the most predictive factors related to outcomes. And so this is where choir really comes in and can fill this unmet need. Now, what we know, based on the fact that some of these psychosocial predictors are more powerfully predictive of outcomes, is that there's an unmet need to actually not only phenotype patients, but also to deliver targeted psychosocial interventions. Some of the work that myself and colleagues have done have demonstrated that not only is there an unmet need to phenotype, but we also don't have enough skilled providers, skilled psychologists, mental health therapists in the United States to treat people prior to surgery or to treat them at all if they have chronic pain. When we're talking about the magnitude, the volume of patients who are going in for surgery, tens of thousands, just at Stanford alone, we can quickly see that we need some scalable solutions to meet this need. And so we were fortunate enough in the last 6 months or so to receive a grant to integrate choir into our pre-op clinic. And this would then allow us to phenotype all patients coming in prior to surgery, and then to determine who's at risk. And this could be based on the risk of if they come in and they have chronic pain, they're on chronic opioid therapy, they would be at risk to have greater pain after surgery, so that we could then have an automated notification go to the acute pain service, and so that they would be, again, receive a targeted therapy based on their pre-surgical characteristics. Similarly, if an individual was a high catastrophizer, we can identify that in the pre-op clinic, and then they could be delivered an automated treatment to target this pre-surgical psychological risk factor. So who develops chronic pain? Depends on the surgery, but as many as 30% of patients who receive common surgeries will go on to have ongoing pain 6 months after the surgery. We consider this chronic pain. And you might think that the biggest factors that would predict who has pain might be disease characteristics, the surgeon, the surgery type, but in fact it's the individual characteristics that are often the most predictive. And unsurprisingly, pain catastrophizing is one of the most powerful prognostic indicators for the chronification of pain. So it's incredibly important to target. You already have sort of a brief definition of what that is, so I won't reiterate that. What we know about pain catastrophizing is it has a profound effect on the nervous system, that it changes neural patterns, not only in the context of pain, but also at rest. Actually has an impact on the structure of the brain, and when catastrophizing is treated effectively, we see a reversal of these actual structural volumetric changes that are observed in the brain, and it powerfully predicts the chronification of pain. So an important therapeutic target. The way I explain it to my patients is that imagine that this is your pain, and when we catastrophize our pain, and we can catastrophize actual pain or anticipated pain, and when we do that, it leads to an amplification in the nervous system that's essentially like pouring a can of gasoline on that fire. And again, is associated with very poor outcomes. In the surgical context, we see that it predicts pain, postoperative opioid use, and again, the development of chronic pain. So Sean had mentioned this 2-hour class. It's essentially compressed pain psychology. And this was shown to be effective in our pilot work, and it's what the class is, this is the compressed class. It's 2 hours. It's pain education. It's also cognitive behavioral therapy. So I understand there's many psychologists in the room. So it's really sort of standard cognitive behavioral therapy, but really compressed into a format that's easy for people to understand very focally in the context of catastrophizing versus broad pain management. Our pilot data were successful, and we used this to leverage into a $4 million NIH grant. This is a 3-arm randomized controlled trial, and this is launching this fall. Now the big question is, can we take this, what appears to be successful in the outpatient setting for individuals with chronic pain, and can we then adapt it for the surgical setting? And so this is what we've done with this remote perioperative pain psychology program, and this is called My Surgical Success. It's essentially the 2-hour outpatient class. It's adapted for surgical patients. Not all of them have chronic pain going into surgery, but some do. And this is put on video. So it's now a 90-minute video. It's one-stop shopping on the internet. You go to the internet page, and you can watch the video, you can download the personalized plan, you can download an audio file. So what we're doing with Choir in the pre-op clinic is we phenotype patients. Those who are identified as catastrophizers are sent an email link. They can then engage in this automated pain psychology treatment. They can do this at home. They can actually do it on their phone. And then this flow chart here, I'm not sure how well you can see it in the back, but we're studying this right now in a randomized controlled trial, really enrolling people the traditional way, meaning we consent them. But in the pre-op clinic, we're going to be doing this in an automated way where we simply invite people to engage in this free automated treatment. This allows us to dismantle all of the barriers to traditional pain psychology and health psychology and offer it to anybody who's interested. This is something of a proof of concept and a feasibility study, as we're actually interested to see how many people engage in this with minimal support and structured follow-up with a clinician. But we're hoping for good results from that.
Great, thank you, Beth. I'm going to just close out with, I think, 2 or 3 just last slides to kind of show you where we're going. Very briefly, if you look at medical sciences and you take gene expression as a model, you'll note back decades ago we used to do this very laborious southern blot through gel electrophoretic processes for single genes, one after another. That was then supplemented back in the 90s by the gene expression array, where we could now do thousands and thousands of these, and now into this century where you can actually dive into the molecular machinery of the cells. We need to do the same thing with these patient-reported outcomes, move from pen and paper instruments and into things like hierarchical linear clustering, which you see in the middle here, where every row is a patient, every column is a PRO. And what we've now recently done is taken this in a completely data-driven approach and used things like Bayesian network reconstruction to identify how these networks connect with each other. What we'll find, by the way, here is that over and over again we see that fatigue, pain catastrophizing, social functioning keep showing up within these nodes. Where we're ultimately working to go towards is to integrate in other types of biometric data. I do a lot of brain imaging at Stanford, our team does there. We're integrating that type of information. Handheld devices, everybody's got the Fitbits these days, working to get that integrated in, and to ultimately move from the bedside to bites to bench and then back again. Where are we going in the future is to implement this across multiple academic sites. Again, it is an open source model. We've done this for pain as well as other clinical conditions. It is not just pain focused. An aggregated data repository across the sites with appropriate governance. We are collecting genetic information on large numbers of patients that come into our clinic to integrate that into the model. Software-based decision support, targeted education and therapy, some of which Beth has mentioned, others which we're integrating in through something called a Choir app, which runs on both iOS as well as Android. You can actually go and download it off of the Apple Store or the Android Store if you do a search on Choir app and I think pain. You can download it to your device. Adaptive randomization for pragmatic trials, so we can do those large simple trial designs, mobile device integration, and we're also getting natural language processing built into the clinical notes. And then finally, again, just to bring some closure to this, we are offering it in open source licensing with very minimal restrictions. Only 2 of them. One is a non-commercialization, non-monetization restriction. We're trying to keep this very pure and non-commercial, and the other is a non-redistribution. But the data is owned by the individual site, and so is the code can be done with whatever they want. We're ultimately hoping to get to this point where we can answer the question, what works for Sandra under what conditions and when, and also translate that to all of the patients that we see and ultimately lead to this cultural transformation in pain care and healthcare that we all desire. With that, let me close out and say thank you again. It truly has been an honor and a delight to be here with you. Thank you.